All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks again for a great day yesterday. We're starting off the second and last day of our symposium with a panel that takes us into and explores some dimensions of the present conjuncture in India's democratic trajectory. This is obviously a turbulent conjuncture. It's one that's defined, above all, perhaps, by what Stuart Hall once referred to in a different context as authoritarian populism. And we're going to try and get a handle on some of the contradictions, the nature of that turbulence, through three papers presented by Subir Sinha from SOAS, Ajantha Subramanian from Harvard, and Kathinka Frøystad from the University of Oslo. Subir will speak on anti-congressism, yes, that's right, and the lineages of the rise of the Hindu right in Indian democracy. Ajantha will speak about merit and caste in contemporary India, producing upper casteness at the IITs. And Kathinka will speak about ritual inclusivity in turbulent times. Just like yesterday, each speaker has 20 minutes. There will be a comment from Manali Desai, and then we'll open it up for questions, comments, and discussion. All right, can I ask Subir to start out? Will you?
Yes, why not? Someone has to, so I will. Hello, everyone. First of all, my apologies to Manali. I did not send her a paper to respond to. Some of you might be aware that there are issues back in India that I have had to deal with while I've been here. When, fairly recently, just a few months ago, Nitish Kumar, the Bihar Chief Minister, who was a part of the UPA alliance since 1914, decided that he wanted to leave the UPA alliance and join the NDA alliance. A lot of coverage in the Indian press talked about his duplicity, the fact that he was a traitor to the cause. And to some extent, this was kind of surprising because of the fact that he had been projected as a possible challenger to Modi. And reasons for this capitulation have not really been very clear. I'll come back to that question later. But let me start off by saying that, in fact, instead of thinking of this as some kind of a treachery, one should put this particular action in a longer trajectory of a particular strand in post-1947 Indian politics, which is the strand basically of anti-congressism. Now, yesterday we heard about the fact that in the years leading up to 1947, the Congress was, on the one hand, full of people who were communists or to the left, as well as people who were to the right, and Hindus, particularly those of the Hindu Mahasabha. In other words, one could think of the Congress before 1947 as one of those attempts in which some kind of a unity between the people with a capital P and the people with small p's was being attempted. Now, if you think in terms of the literature on populism, one of the points that Laclau makes is that all democratic politics is precisely to be able to make that kind of a bridge between the people as a whole and the people as such. And he makes the argument that this bridging is, on the one hand, impossible, but on the other hand, no democratic politics can actually go without that particular kind of an effect. And in making that kind of a bridge, populations which are either considered excluded from the demos or populations which are made external to the democratic public find some space of political articulation. And that, in fact, is the paradoxical politics of populist democracies. Now, in terms of looking at populist democracies, one of the interesting points that, in fact, towards the end of his essay on civil and political society in post-colonial India, Chatterjee closes his paper with three hypotheses. He says the most significant site of transformation in the colonial period is that of civil society, whereas the most significant transformation occurring in post-colonial period are in political society. Second, he says the question that frames the debate over social transformation in the colonial period is that of modernity. In political society, he says, the framing question is that of democracy. And he ends his paper by saying that in the context of the latest phase of the globalization of capital, we may well be witnessing an emerging conflict between modernity and democracy, that is, between civil and political society. To my mind, this kind of settings, modernity, civil society on the one hand, and political society and democracy on the other, is an interesting way to structure the entire problematic of anti-Congressism. Let me start off by looking at 3 particular episodes of anti-Congressism before I move on to looking at how the nature of anti-Congress politics has evolved, in particular over the last 7 or 8 years. We know very well about the Hindu Mahasabha and the Hindu rights antipathy to Nehru, and in particular, if you look at the sort of cartoon representations of, from Hindu Mahasabha magazines and newspapers of the time, you find very easily a kind of an argument which says that, not Gandhi, but in fact Nehru should have been assassinated. So they clearly saw him as being an inauthentic representative of the people, and therefore also made the argument that the entire project of composing the people as such into the people as a whole was partly compromised by the fact that India was a democracy too early. Nehru was a liberal and a left-wing person who was inauthentic in terms of being a proper representative of the people as such. From the left, whereas the communists had a lot of support that they gave to Nehru at that point in time, there was a third strand of politics, which at some level one could say was exemplified by Lohia. And if you look at Lohia's critiques of Nehru, first is the hypocrisy, he says, of Nehru's claim to be a Democrat and the repeated argument that Nehru makes regarding the fact that Indian politics should not be dominated by a strong leader, while in fact Nehru was that strong leader who dominated Indian politics. So whereas for the right, the democracy was too premature, for Indian socialists, that democracy was false primarily because of the fact that Nehru stood so far above the rest of the political field. Lohia then makes a couple of other arguments which are also democratic arguments. One argument he makes is the fact that Nehru does not sufficiently support liberation struggles in West Africa, which were ongoing at that point in time. And he makes a very strong critique of Nehru's inauthentic democratic credentials based upon the fact that when it came time for solidarity with these national liberation movements, which had been fraternal with the Indian National Congress, he basically sides with the English, with the British at that point in time. Second, his arguments regarding China. One again sees how much China and Nehru are connected even in contemporary political discourse. And in that particular context, they make an argument not just about the fact that Nehru has a miscalculation regarding China, but that Nehru's support for China and all kinds of in all kinds of international forums further debilitate his claims to be a true Democrat. That basically what Nehru is seen as doing is being a supporter of totalitarianism in China and imperialism in West Africa. Now, having made these kinds of critiques, Lohia takes a very interesting turn, which is that he becomes quite close to the Hindu Mahasabha and to the Jansang. And through the 1950s and 1960s, there are episodes in which Lohia actually campaigns together with the Jansang and with the Hindu Mahasabha. This does not necessarily result in a lot of advantage to the Hindu right. In fact, they win 2 seats or 4 seats in various parliamentary elections. So that's moment one, in which there's an emerging anti-Congressism, in which you have on the left the Hindu Mahasabha, on the right the Hindu Mahasabha and the precursors of Hindutva politics today, and on the left people such as Lohia, who are on the one hand critics of communism, but on the other hand they're also making arguments which are about third world solidarity and about some kind of a more authentic democracy. Moment two is the movement against Mrs. Gandhi and the national emergency. And here you have a different kind of an anti-Congressism, because this is basically at the end of the development, the Nehruvian development model. There's mass unemployment, there are massive numbers of youth movements. And then starting away from Gujarat in 1970-72, when you have the Nav Nirman movement and so on, you have a further slipping away of the people composed within in the post-1947 political settlement, who are now excluded and are also oppositional to the Congress. So if you look at the emergency itself and you look at the anti-emergency movement, on the one hand, you have a very wide range of political positions within that particular configuration. But again, you can see ambiguities there. Balasaheb Devaras, who was the head of the RSS at that point in time, refers to Mrs. Gandhi as Chandi Avatar, a goddess. and particularly on the question of the nuclear explosions that she tried out in Pokhran. Vajpayee himself compares Mrs. Gandhi to Durga, while at the same time, the students' wing of the BJP is quite heavily involved in the anti-emergency politics. On the left side of the spectrum, obviously, you have Naxalites who are against the emergency, but the mainstream communist parties have supported the emergency at that point in time, particularly the CPI comes out in support of it. So you have, again, a kind of an ambiguous moment. But interestingly, if you look at the sort of, one could probably, think in terms of the imprisonments of activists. And in fact, if you speak to people in the BJP or in the RJD today, a lot of them went to prison at the same time, sometimes in the cells that they shared. For example, Ravi Shankar Prasad of the BJP with Lalu Yadav of the RJD and things like that. So the prison itself becomes a site for a new kind of an anti-Congressism. And you can hear this in speeches of Modi. For example, in the UP elections, when he talks about Akhilesh Yadav being a betrayer of his father because his father had been tortured during the emergency of Mrs. Gandhi, and that the son was being, in some ways, a traitor to the father in that particular election. Referring also to people such as, the Chief Minister of Punjab, of that time, Prakash Singh Badal, as the Nelson Mandela of India, because of the long prison sentences that he had, suffered at that point in time. So by the end of the emergency, in any case, anti-Congressism is very much a dominant political force. You have non-Congress governments. Many of the components of today's alliances can be tracked down to that particular moment. You also have suggestions by non-BJP elements that the BJP should actually dissolve itself and become a broad anti-Congress front. So of all of the other non-Congress parties except for the left. Now, in this particular moment, the BJP decides that it does not want to dissolve itself and retains, even at a position of relative disadvantage, a specific kind of an identity. So by the time we are looking at the sort of third moment of anti-Congressism, which is a post-globalization moment of, the moment of globalization that Partha Chatterjee is talking about, when he sees this conflict between civil and political society and between modernity and development, and modernity and democracy, we now look at a kind of composing of the people behind the BJP, which is of a different order altogether than the anti-Congressisms of the past, in which the BJP was one, but not the most dominant element of that particular kind of alliance. So I want to now just look at the use of anti-Congressism and the technologies through which it is proliferated into popular culture and popular consciousness as a way of making that bridge between the people in general and the people as such, which is what is going on with respect to the Modi political project. How much do you want time? 10. Okay. So let me introduce two or three notions. One of them is the idea of total politics. I borrowed this from Afzal Moin's recent book, which is called Millennial Sovereignty, which is on the politics of Akbar. Now, what Moin argues is that the entire canvas on which politics is done is a completely seamless one in the case of Akbar. And one can think perhaps a little bit like that in terms of the BJP, and particularly in terms of Modi's politics at the moment. So in other words, if one thinks of liberalism as having some kind of a stable definition of the polity, the economy and society, or the field of culture, if you think about politics with respect to dress, food, occupation, and so on, there is a much broader sweep of that kind of politics. There is nothing which is not political in the way in which Modi's politics has evolved over the last few years, especially since 2009, when he begins to think himself as a possible prime ministerial candidate, the canvas of politics becomes extremely large. Now, one way to think about that is, again, to go back to Laclau, where he talks about the fact that in populist democratic politics, you have a serial creation of cleavages. And so each and every site, your diet, your everyday life, what you look, where you live, etc., become part of that spectrum on which a serial cleavage can be created. Second, I want to basically talk in terms of a domain that I'm calling crypto politics. And by crypto-politics, I'm basically talking about a very wide range of cultural and or maybe technological and cultural artifacts. Here I'm really talking about things like fake news. I'm talking here about morphed audio and video images. Very often you might see data which comes out which is entirely inauthentic. You basically have a situation in which government's figures today, someone might say that the growth is at 6.7% versus 7.7%. There is a crisis in terms of what is believable on the basis of which you can then base your politics. So insofar as all liberal political sort of thinking takes a kind of an assumption that the voter is a rational person, the basis for making that kind of rationality has now been erased by the proliferation of contradictory, fraudulent data and news, which is now commonplace. And of course, the circulation of that, as we heard yesterday from Siddhar's talk in terms of the numbers of WhatsApp users or social media users, there is no longer a reliance on anything like the media to which one could ascribe any degree of believability on the basis of which one could then derive one's political positions. So in other words, from anything like a rational deliberation through which one arrives at a particular political position, we now have arrived at a scenario in which it is affiliations and affect which are entirely the basis for making these kinds of political decisions. In fact, in the recent issue of Cultural Anthropology, which has some very short writings on demonetization, Nayanika Mathur makes a very interesting point that right after demonetization, she's interviewing, in fact, a woman who is working in her mother's house, who is weeping that she has lost her entire life savings. And at the end of her weeping, when Nayanika Mathur asks her, "So you will not be voting for Modi?" And she says, "I didn't say that. I will definitely be voting for Modi again." So to be able to both recognize Modi as an agent who has destroyed your life savings, but still maintain a very deep affective connection where he is the only political choice that you are able to go for, I think is a kind of political move which does not have easy explanation within formal categories of political analysis. The third, so here what we're looking at is a kind of a hyper-reality. Now, if you think in terms of the original writings on hyper-reality, one of the arguments made was that it was in advanced industrial societies, which have advanced technological penetration, that there's a problem in terms of making a distinction between what is real and what is a simulation of the real. Now, in the case of India today, we do not have advanced democracy, but we do have an advanced technological penetration within everyday life. So to my mind, hyper-reality needs to be thought of as a constitutive element of politics, not only in advanced liberal democracies or in advanced capitalist societies, but in societies in general, especially societies which are as technologically saturated as the Indian society seems to be at the moment. There is another element to this crypto politics, and that is there are moves such as, for example, Nitish Kumar's capitulation and rejoining the NDA, where there is no discernible reason. There is a wide range of speculations, scams, has he been blackmailed, and so on. And this is not particular or specific to Nitish Kumar. If you look at the BJP's constitution, and in some ways it brings back the question of anti-Congressism in a different way, 1/3 of the BJP parliamentary politics is defectors from the Congress and other political parties. If you look at Assam, almost half of the BJP's legislative power in Assam is defectors from other political parties. That's also the case for a number of other Northeast Indian states and so on. Why this happens? One could say they have been bought over, and perhaps these are true. But my point is that when I refer to crypto politics, we are referring to phenomenon which are not available at any empirical level for analysis. They are phenomena which are entirely within the realm of speculation. Third, there is a domain that we refer to as the domain of the rational political being, such as the deliberative voter or people who make political decisions based upon some kind of fact or reality, and the domain which is to some extent supernatural. And this is particularly in the case of Modi, a very heavy deployment of this kind of politics has taken place. Now, yesterday I raised a very brief point about what about religious channels like Astha or Sanskar, and particularly their role in the rise of the BJP? Now, if you look at the affiliations of Modi with especially the sort of tele-gurus who begin to become quite big from the sort of, maybe 10 or 15 years, in the case particularly of Gujarat politics initially, where if you think of 2 or 3 of these, gurus, one could think of Asaram Bapu, a very highly, popular guru in North India at that point in time. Massive amounts of land had been given to Asaram for a variety of his ashrams. It was not the case that he was not controversial before the rape charges were brought in. In fact, children had gone missing. In some cases, they were discovered without their internal organs. No action was taken against them. And in fact, there are videos one can watch on YouTube where Asaram is referring to Modi as Mera Shiv Mujhe Mil Gaya. I have found my Shiva. Okay? And at this point in time, you can see the proliferation on YouTube of a variety of very interesting videos. Some of them are in Bhojpuri, and many of them are in languages which I don't know, in which you have ordinary people, quote unquote, who are doing puja in front of a Shiva image, and after several rounds of the arti, the face of Shiva and the face of Modi begin to get blurred. Okay, so you've got the kind of a pictorial realization of Asaram's comments regarding Modi as the Shiva of Indian politics. Of course, many of you have probably received these things on WhatsApp previously, where Modi's face appears in waterfalls. You have stories about on chapatis, someone cuts an aubergine, that is a fairly common one as well. So you have a supernatural phenomenon associated with a politician who is otherwise contesting elections in a supposedly, a democracy of 70 odd years and so on. You also have, for example, in the case of Nehru's elections, the Hindu Mahasabha candidate in Allahabad, whose name escapes me at the moment, was known to go to voters with a lota of Gangajal and holding a cow. And he would ask voters to swear on the Gangajal and the cow that they were going to vote for him. Okay? Now, yeah, if you think in terms of some of the speeches, especially towards the end of the UP elections, where people belonging to the BJP basically come out and make an argument where they say, can you say Jai Shri Ram and so on. So there's a kind of a religious nature of affirming your allegiance to the polity. And to my mind, this is a way in which the political, liberal domain of politics, if you like, and the domain of irrationality are mediated both via technology as well as by the person of Modi himself. To basically come to a close, we have I've been following RSS classmates of mine very closely for the last 2 years. So there's a paper I wanted to write which has just come out. And in particular, I wanted to see how do people who are CEOs of companies or doctors and things like that make use of this kind of, how do they reconcile their modernity with their democracy, going back to the terms of antagonism that I suggested Chatterjee has laid out. And one of the arguments that firstly, the language has changed quite a lot. For example, a lot of the use of the word subaltern, I find quite interesting, is now being used by RSS supporters. And it goes back to that point as the critique of Nehru from the right, where he was seen as being inauthentic and far too liberal and not a real representative of the masses of whom he was pretending to be the leader. And in that particular context, what the argument is that they seem to make is that the BJP takes subalterns as they are, while all other parties have a pedagogical relationship with the subalterns, and they would like them to be something else. So the success of the BJP, according to them, they say, look, if you look, why laugh at the gurus? Millions of people follow them. When you look at Dera Sacha Sauda and the recent, arrest of Guru Ram Rahim and so on, the argument is that these are in fact subaltern religions. These are people excluded from whatever degree of welfarism the Indian state has had, and in fact that the support for gurus and people living in ashrams for ages is in fact an indictment of the model of welfarism that basically had emerged from Nehruvian socialism and whose detritus are basically around us for us to see. So the politics of anti-Congressism really is a politics which is a politics of making a choice between basing politics which assumes that subalterns need to be transformed into something other than subalterns, and another one which says that any such move is a move coming from a high-on, isolated, pedagogical civil society, and that it is an inauthentic move. And in fact, the BJP, more than any other political party now, takes on the voice of speaking for the subalterns, and that brings me to the idea of subaltern complicity, which I very briefly will touch upon, which has been used in particularly the work of John Beasley Murray for Latin America, where he makes the argument that one mistake of liberals and the left is to think of subalterns as somehow naturally left-wing. And the anti-Congressism of today is precisely to reverse the terms of that political formulation. Thanks.
Thank you, Subir. Will you want to Ajantha?
All right. So, thank you to the organizers. Yesterday was awesome. I hope today is as good. Is that too much? It's okay. All right, so we're moving from an incredibly sort of broad canvas of politics and political sociology to something much more ethnographically specific. But I think in my paper too, you see a kind of blurring of the boundaries between elite and subaltern politics in ways that are similar to what Subir described. I'm going to just read the paper. Okay, so in India today, the term merit is a ubiquitous folk category that generates a lot of political heat. Over the post-independence period, merit has come to reference forms of distinction that have a much longer social life, the most important being caste. The relationship between caste and merit is debated in a variety of arenas, but nowhere more vocally and consistently than in engineering education. Within the world of Indian engineering education, the institutions deemed most meritocratic are the Indian Institutes of Technology, or the IITs, which are the focus of my research. Within Indian public discourse, the IITian has become an exemplar of intellectual merit, someone seen as naturally gifted in the technical sciences. What gets included in such assessments of the IITian's innate intelligence and competitiveness are the forms of accumulated social and cultural capital that have enabled admission to the IITs. The majority of IITians come from upper-caste families of bureaucrats, school teachers, and academics, where capital has long been held in education. With the reorganization of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism around the knowledge economy, the value of their accumulated caste capital has spiked. At the same time, the role of caste and state in producing the IITian has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as uniquely meritorious individuals. So the key questions driving my research as a whole are the following. How does privilege become merit? How does the naturalization of the IITian's merit and the elevation of the IITs to emblems of meritocracy inform understandings of caste difference? And what does all this mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation in India? Before I turn to some specifics about the research, let me say a little more about my reasons for taking on this project. One of the main aims was to interrogate the widespread assumption that caste is a more salient basis of social distinction and political self-definition for low than for high castes. More specifically, high caste urban professionals are thought to have transcended caste to adopt more modern forms of identification. At the same time, professional classes and elite institutional spaces like the IITs continue to be overwhelmingly high caste in composition until fairly recently. Moreover, attempts at opening up these spaces to low caste are consistently met with fervent opposition, not in the name of caste, but in the name of preserving merit. Despite clear evidence of continuing caste stratification and the discursive claims to merit by high caste, there is very little scholarship that addresses this link. And this is where I see my work coming in. I look at the role of engineering education, and the IITs in particular, in producing newly consolidated forms of upper casteness. I'm particularly interested in how the notion of merit comes to index caste belonging and serve as a publicly legitimate expression of caste distinction. And to be clear, my project is not about the longer history of caste as jati. Rather, I want to understand how constitutional measures to redress caste inequality through reserved quotas in higher education have produced caste distinction at a different scale. While jati itself is a historically dynamic category that remains a key marker of social distinction, my concern is with how and why the opposition between the consolidated categories of upper and lower caste has acquired salience within and beyond higher education. So in getting at the production of upper casteness, I build on the recent work of Satish Deshpande, who's called for more analysis of how high castes are rendered casteless in India. The story of how high castes, quote, transform their caste capital into modern capital is not well known, he says, because it runs with the grain of the dominant common sense. When it is seen and heard, quote, it appears to be a story about something other than caste, like the story of nation building. By contrast, the political encashment of caste by low castes is a recurrent, publicly debated theme. The result of this asymmetry, he maintains, is that high castes are naturalized as the casteless inheritors of modernity, while low castes are hyper-visible as the illegitimate purveyors of caste. Deshpande points in particular to the first post-colonial legal challenge to caste quotas in education as a critical moment. In 1951, two Tamil Brahmin petitioners made recourse to constitutionalism to supersede a regional milieu where redistributive mechanisms to level the inequities of caste were fast becoming part of political common sense. They claimed that their fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination, guaranteed by Article 15.1 of the Constitution, was violated by the quotas applied in medical and engineering colleges. The Madras High Court agreed. A key passage in the judgment states, quote, it may be that through the fortuitous operation of a rule, which in itself is not discriminatory, a special advantage is enjoyed by some citizens belonging to a particular caste or community. This advantage is not taken away by Article 15.1. If students belonging to a certain community or caste by reason of their caste discipline, habits and modes of life, satisfy the prescribed requirements in larger numbers than others, it is not permissible to shut them out on that score. It would be strange if in this land of equality and liberty, a class of citizens should be constrained to wear the badge of inferiority because, forsooth, they have a greater aptitude for certain types of education than other classes, end quote. So here we see the reframing of caste from a system of graded inequality into community life and historical advantage into collective aptitude. By contrast, it's the quota as a mechanism of redistributive justice that is identified as a source of discrimination. Deshpande argues that the 1951 verdict offered upper castes a form of agency, quote, based on the universal normative position of castelessness. Constitutionally and legally, caste was henceforth to be recognized only as a source of disadvantage or vulnerability, not as a source of privilege or advantage. As such, he continues, it authored and disseminated a new kind of common sense, where the very definition of caste was truncated and equated with the lower castes. This common sense only deepened when the courts shifted in favor of administering redress through caste quotas. Those who qualified for educational quotas on the basis of social disadvantages were identified with the reserved category on the basis of their caste affiliation, whereas those who did not qualify were simply classed under the open category of merit-based admissions. The absenting of caste from the post-colonial administrative classification of high caste students marked a key transition in official parlance that came to intersect in critical ways with their self-fashioning as meritocratic moderns. So my work builds on Deshpande's but adds a key component, the relational dynamic between capital accumulation and subaltern assertion. In part, this is in order to illuminate caste as the product of longer historical relationships and to show how it has been reconfigured in the context of democratic politics. But it's also to make the more general point that caste does not simply reproduce itself through seamless transmutations of capital. The proliferation of rights discourses in politics, the extension of universal franchise, and the entry of new social groups into social and economic spaces previously monopolized by elites have posed real challenges to caste hierarchies. What I hope to show is how high caste strategies, such as the claim to merit, are part of the effort to secure arenas of expertise and accumulation against low caste advancement. Within the IIT system, my ethnographic focus is on IIT Madras. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at this relationship between capital accumulation and low caste assertion, because Dravidianism has complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of high castes into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with strong traditions of low caste rights, high caste intellectual achievement is understood as a legacy of historical social inequalities requiring correctives. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question Deshpande's account of castelessness as a stable structure of post-colonial high caste subjectivity. Departing from his analysis, I ask how Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of upper casteness more broadly. So when do high castes claim merit on the basis of castelessness, and when do they do so on the basis of caste? When one looks back at the 1951 verdict, taking Dravidianism into account, one sees a slightly different picture. Rather than castelessness, the verdict reconstituted caste as culture, as natural aptitude, and as the very basis of merit, or formulation that lives on in upper caste claims. Contrary to Deshpande's argument, high caste did not just come to think of themselves as casteless. Rather, they began to mark caste affiliation differently, and in ways that expressed understandings of both caste natures and democratic culture. To put it differently, the naming of Tamil Brahmins as Brahmins by the Dravidian movement catalyzed the interplay of self-marking and unmarking, through which they made caste belonging consistent with merit. And they did so in reaction to low caste assertion, and in contradistinction to the reserved category. In this sense, Tamil Nadu is an important precedent in making the open category, or the non-reserved category, a putatively universal norm whose external limit is caste backwardness. With the expansion of low caste rights politics across the subcontinent, this claim to merit as the non-reserved has become a more generalized phenomenon, seen not just in legal challenges to reservations, but in social movements such as the anti-Mendel agitations of 1990 and 2006, as well as in more quotidian practices. Although the Tamil Brahmin experience is an important precedent of this dialectic of merit and rights, I want to be clear that I don't see this proliferating politics of meritocracy simply as the new Brahminism. Rather, the asymmetry of caste classification, of state class classification, with caste marking on one side and its unmarking on the other, has produced a consolidated form of upper casteness. So let me turn to IIT Madras as one key site for these processes. It was in the context of early Tamil Brahmin challenges to reservations that IIT Madras was founded in 1959 and came to play a critical role in suturing caste and merit. As a central government institution initially exempt from caste quotas, it has long been seen by its detractors as an upper caste stronghold, where claims to intellectual superiority have strong caste overtones. IIT Madras is even sardonically referred to by some in the vernacular press as Iyer Iyengar technology, in reference to the two Tamil Brahmin subcastes. What is less considered in these popular discourses is how the institution operates as a critical site, not for the expression of an already existing group identity, but for the very constitution of upper casteness. At IIT Madras, distinguishing high from low is an ongoing preoccupation. Defining who the true IITian is has become all the more urgent because of key changes in the past 3 decades. The first was the proliferation of private engineering colleges from the early 1990s, when growing numbers of students from across the social spectrum began to acquire degrees and employment in a rapidly growing information technology sector. The second change was the explosion in the number of coaching centers to train students for the IIT entrance exam, which brought in students from outside the major metropolitan centers and from other class backgrounds. The third change was a 2006 Indian Supreme Court decision mandating the extension of a 27% quota for other backward classes in all central government-funded institutions, including the IITs. The quota began to be applied in admissions from 2008 and has substantially increased the number of low-caste students at the IITs. The influx of these new categories of students into the IITs has been profoundly destabilizing. While earlier the institutional norm was one of an assumed upper casteness, shored up by the putative universality of the open category and the extreme marginalization of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe students, now the presence of, and the increasing presence of various imposters has necessitated the more explicit and ongoing policing of boundaries. So let me give you some examples of these. So in the next part of the talk, I'll highlight some key ways of defining the true IITian that have emerged in response to these perceived encroachments by various others. And what I hope to show is that these forms of distinction hinge on correlations between caste, knowledge, and merit. So the first has to do with the idea that upper caste knowledge is more mobile than lower caste knowledge. This was conveyed to me by an IIT Madras faculty member who had spent a decade in US industry before returning to teach at his alma mater. He fretted to me about the negative, this is his term, negative brand effect that quota students would have. For cultural reasons, fewer of them go abroad, he told me, and this will definitely mean a decline from those days when 70% of Silicon Valley companies had IITian names on the board. This expectation that the true IITian should be a mobile subject doesn't arise from a generic or recent claim to cosmopolitanism. It reflects the worldview of a high caste intelligentsia who were members of a pan-Indian diaspora of civil servants and whose children form the core of the IITs. A shared history of education and employment has given these students a sense of themselves not just as members of regional caste groupings, but as nationals who properly belong in national institutions. Within Tamil Nadu, it is Brahmins, the caste who entered the modern professions in the greatest numbers, who have historically formed the core of this internal diaspora. As a result, they're overrepresented in central board schools that cater to children of the national civil services. While these are national schools, in the Tamil context, the central board maps quite explicitly onto high caste and has become the basis for claims to intellectual merit. At IIT coaching centers in Chennai, monopolized by high caste, there's a working assumption that the central board curriculum produces thinking students who are better suited to intellectual life and the IITs than students of state board schools. It was this training, they argued, that made their students a natural fit, first for the IITs and then for transnational careers. And this sort of tension, this long-standing tension between the central and state boards should put the recent opposition to DEET and the opposition to the imposition of the central board on regional education in Tamil Nadu in some perspective. So Karthik, a Tamil Brahmin alumnus who graduated in 1995 from IIT Madras, talked to me about his educational trajectory. He had attended central board schools in Delhi and Bhopal before joining one in Chennai. Karthik described the school as a bubble within the city, where the vast majority of his classmates were high caste, and where getting into IIT Madras was the singular goal of his peers. Once he got there, Karthik told me, he felt truly at home. He talked about the comforting sense of homecoming he felt about entering the campus gates, where he could stop de-Brahminizing his Tamil and slip back into the Brahmin vernacular spoken by his family. Karthik also spoke of an intimacy between Tamil Brahmin students and professors through the cultivation not just of shared intellectual projects, but of a form of extended caste kinship, expressed, for instance, in invitations to family functions. But IIT Madras has not simply been a site for Brahmin caste kinship within a non-Brahmin region. On campus, other Tamilians who get in through the open category are assumed to be Brahmin. Gopi, an OBC Tamil alumnus from a state board school, narrated his own conscription into Brahminness to me. He told me that he was changing his clothes after having a bath when his Tamil Brahmin roommate inquired into the whereabouts of his punal, the sacred thread worn by male Brahmins. When I told him that I don't wear one, he paused and then asked, "Doesn't your mother get upset?" It never struck him that I was backward caste. In fact, I think he still assumes that I'm from a particularly liberal Brahmin family. So Gopi's experience of his own illegibility speaks not so much to the castelessness of the IITian, but to his explicit marking when it comes to Tamils as Brahmin. This desire to erase difference is particularly telling in the context of Tamil Nadu, where a long history of reservations has meant that increasing numbers of low castes do, in fact, inhabit the same institutional spaces as high castes. Here, IIT Madras has uniquely served the need to once again differentiate high from low. Just when caste status boundaries are blurring in the wider region, within the walls of the institution, it has become imperative to mark the Tamil IITian as Brahmin, and in this way to reinstate merit and its associated forms of mobility as indices of upper casteness. This sense of the true IITian as someone with a natural propensity for conceptual thought is also expressed in anxieties about the marketization of education. The IIT entrance exam, as all of you probably know, is the most mythologized of all of India's post-secondary exams. It's widely perceived as a near-perfect measure of merit, where only the best are filtered out of a vast pool of applicants. But in the past 20 years, the coaching industry has destabilized some of these assumptions. The rapid expansion of exam coaching has shifted the profile of students at IIT Madras to include a large contingent from rural high-caste families in neighboring Andhra Pradesh. Their arrival, however, has not been met with equanimity. In a newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, IIT Madras's former director, M.S. Ananth, clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. Wow, okay, I'm out of time. The notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IIT. Okay, so essentially you have all of these students from Andhra Pradesh who've come in, and in some ways, their entry has been met with a sort of new kind of distinction that's been drawn between the gifted on the one hand and the coached on the other, right? Which is about another distinction, because everybody recognizes that every IITian has gone to coaching classes. So there's this sort of distinction drawn between the gifted who go to these boutique classes, right, where conceptual thought is the norm, versus coaching factories in places like Kota in Rajasthan and in Andhra Pradesh, right, where one is taught rote learning, right? And I think that in some ways, the presence of these Telugu students, who are themselves rural high caste, has been even more destabilizing, right, for sort of notions of upper casteness. Because after the implementation of the 2008 quota, it's become much easier to consign all low-caste students, right, to the reserve category, regardless of how they actually got admission. This is a kind of working assumption now, right? But these Telugu students are problematic because they're seen as the wrong kind of high caste, right? Because their unfamiliarity with English, their open embrace of regionalism. So I was told over and over again, these people speak Telugu. They shouldn't be speaking Telugu, right? This is sort of this is a national institutional space. So all of this produces incredible levels of discomfort, right? So these are sort of two kinds of distinctions, right, between the sort of two school boards, which speak to these regional caste tensions, and then also this distinction between the gifted and the coached, which is a sort of broader concern. So the last thing I want to talk about is this notion of the IITs as spaces of immaterial knowledge, that this is where engineering is taught differently. This is where engineering is taught as a science and not just as technique, right? So this is yet another distinction. And this association of immaterial knowledge with engineering perhaps sounds strange, right? Because typically the immaterial is thought of in association with the pure sciences and not the applied sciences. But this sort of distinction between the conceptual and practical has been a crucial part of institutional stratification, even within the technical sciences, for a very long time. And it dates back to the beginnings of late colonial technical training, which I don't have time to go into. But it's become sort of even more exacerbated now that IITians have almost exclusively shifted away from the shop floor. So most people don't even go into engineering anymore as a profession, right? Most now go into finance or management or computer science, right? And the disassociations of IITians from the state industrial sector and associations with the topmost echelons of these post-industrial economies in both India and the US has reinforced their status as an intellectual elite. And I spoke to a number of recruiters within Chennai, right? And they make a very sort of clear distinction between IITians, who they see as far more suitable for the sort of managerial stratum, right, of IT, or for sort of high-level research, right? And they're very aware of the JEE exam ranking system, right? And where the cutoff is for the open category. So a number of students who came in through the quota told me stories of how they had tried for these jobs, and they were pointedly asked for their JEE rank at the final stage of recruiting, right? And despite having done well in the interviews up to that point, most never got the jobs, right? And so I'm just going to end with something about the US. Oh, okay, I'm ending. So in the US, right, caste is not a legible category in the same way that it is in India. So in the US, what happens is that university admissions committees and corporate recruiters, they resort instead to these broad brush racial typologies, right, in explaining the IITian's intellect. And this sort of recourse to race and the language of race to talk about the sort of exceptionalism of the IITian is facilitated by these diasporic IITian networks, which have been incredibly active in protecting their brand value, right, to sort of shore up its exceptional standing. And you know, this has happened in a variety of ways. One is this: there was an interview, there was a specific episode on the IITs done by the news program 60 Minutes in 2003. And I just want to give you this one quote. Vinod Khosla, who is the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, basically argued, he said that Fortune 500 headhunters favor IITians almost over anyone else. And this is his quote. He says, if you're a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, if you're a WASP walking into in for a job, you wouldn't have as much pre-assigned credibility as you do if you're an engineer from the IITs. Right? And you know what they talk about, this sort of project of shoring up the IITs as the project of producing brand IIT, right? And so this idea of the entry of low castes as threatening the institutional brand, I think is a really important instance of not the transformation of caste into modern capital, but the inverse, right? That the market value of brand IIT is much more explicitly equated with upper casteness itself. So what does all this mean? I'm ending. Two paragraphs. So in post-independence India, you have these new patterns of caste stratification and consolidation, which have emerged not despite, but because of the process of democratic transformation, because and through the process of democratic transformation. And rather than the gradual erosion of caste, what we're seeing is the leveraging of merit by high castes in order to secure new arenas of expertise and accumulation against low caste rights. And the consolidation of upper casteness has been facilitated by transnational mobility and the resurgence within the late 20th century knowledge economy of ascriptive understandings of skill and intelligence. So rather than just subaltern identitarianism, then, the leveraging of caste must also be seen as a high caste politics that attempts to forestall democratic progress and derives its legitimacy from a larger global politics of ascription. So what does this suggest for our understanding of post-colonial democracy? In some ways, these high caste strategies only harden the divide between modernity and democracy. Although now modernity is framed not in the terms of mid-20th century civic universalism and national developmentalism, but as private accumulation and global achievement. Even as elites evacuate public arenas and make explicitly identitarian claims to private spheres of accumulation, it is subalterns who articulate universalistic commitments to equality, well-being, and rights. So in this sense, what we're witnessing is a muddying of the distinction between elite civic universalism and subaltern communitarian particularism. So much recent work on subaltern politics, my own included, has taken its cues from the political language and maneuvers of subalterns to interrogate received wisdom about democracy. Such analyses of subaltern politics have provoked a reappraisal of democratic politics to include forms of political agency previously seen as pre-political, non-political, or non-democratic. But despite these ways of rethinking democracy, there's been less effort to understand how the political imaginaries and tactics of the powerful are shaped by those of the seemingly powerless. The story of making merit at IIT Madras illuminates this broader relational dynamic as an integral part of the democratic process. Sorry about that.
And we're moving along to Kathinka for the last presentation.
I think this is my glass. Okay, thank you very much. My voice is a bit rusty today, so I hope it will last through the talk. My paper is also kind of primarily ethnographic, and the reason for that is that I was asked to... Can I raise the microphone? How about that? Does that work better? Okay, I can't see that my talk, but that's okay. I'll stand a bit to the side. All right, so I was asked to contribute to this conference and its main topic through my ongoing research. And it's still ongoing, so it's a little bit scary to present it in this forum, but I do it anyway. So what I'm doing here is to, in the paper, is to keep my ears to the ground and report some of the findings that I think, you know, can speak into these issues from my fieldwork. I'm working on interreligious boundaries, and my talk is titled Ritual Inclusivity in Turbulent Times. And I begin with the observation, which many of you probably are familiar with, that there seemed to be a very widespread argument that the famous composite culture in India, especially in the region where I work, which is Uttar Pradesh, where it's called the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, is in deep decline. One separating factor, which a lot of historians point to, is the many reform movements that have promoted ritual purification over the past century or so, whether they come in the shape of Arya Samaj, Tablighi Jamaat, or more recent movements with international backing. Another separating factor, of course, is the ethno-religious violence and the fear it instigates, ever from the partition riots to the post-demolition riots in 1992 and later. And the third one is, of course, the topic that many of the former speakers have mentioned here yesterday, namely the free-range activity of vigilante groups emboldened by the Modi government, which has resulted in a series of attacks on young Muslim men suspected of enamoring Hindu girls, slaughtering cows, or denigrating Hindu deities. Whatever the separating factor that is emphasized, the overall picture we get is that of an ever-increasing ritual, social, and habitational withdrawal. Phrased differently, religious communities are increasingly held to pray with their own, socialize with their own, and live among their own, whether by choice or by compulsion. Now, as a long-term tendency, this description is probably true. But what it tends to overlook are the motives that make people act against this overall trend. As far as ritual inclusivity and joint worship are concerned, the master narrative of decline overlooks the concerns that make people approach whatever divine being or practice they believe can be assistance to the particular problem they struggle with here and now, even when knowing that they should not, and even when risking social sanctions. So what looks like withdrawal from a distance is sometimes just discretion or secrecy when studied up close. As long as so many Indians struggle with long-term unemployment, inhuman pressure to do well at school, incurable medical ailments, untreated medical problems, deep economic insecurity, unsettling family disputes, impermissible love relations, and so on, without anywhere to turn from help, the impulse to cross religious boundaries in pursuit of divine intervention has persisted. Despair can triumph both shame and fear, and unfortunately there is still ample of despair to be found, particularly in areas where India is neither shining, Swachh, or marked by Achhe Din. So let me just expand this argument with a handful of examples from the research that I'm involved with at the moment. Since 2014, I have headed a project titled Indian Cosmopolitan Alternatives, consisting of 8 case studies on ritual engagement across official religious boundaries. Our fieldwork spans 6 Indian states. We're working in Punjab, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, Assam, and even Arunachal Pradesh, and 6 religious traditions. Now, while our methodological variation within this project makes us unable to undertake modes of comparison in the positivist way, it has proven ideal for detecting actually how many modes of ritual inclusivity that exists still. So in this way, it has alerted us to the fact that ritual inclusivity remains far more widespread than suggested by the many reports of its demise. Since it would be unfair to report from the unpublished material of my project partners, I have to restrict my examples to the material that has emanated from my own fieldwork. Since 2013, I have made annual field visits to the city of Kanpur in Uttar Pradesh, which until recently was known as one of the Bimaru states, which of course you know. Uttar Pradesh, in many ways, is still Bimar, having the second lowest GDP per capita of all Indian states and ranking only 18th of 21 in terms of human development the last time its HDI index was measured in 2007. Kanpur is located in the heart of Uttar Pradesh and competes with Lucknow in terms of population size. But in contrast to Lucknow, we find no architectural marvels, no remnants of the elite Nawabs that once ruled the region. All we find are the abandoned cotton mills that once made Kanpur famous as one of the Manchesters of the East alongside Ahmedabad, but that now rather makes the city look like a forerunner for Detroit. And since I started working there, we've also had, since Yogi Adityanath came to power, a closure of a lot of the leather tanneries. That also was one of the backbones of the city. So my field site, which I term Millanganj in my writings, is a dusty, potholed neighborhood in the outskirts of town. It comprises a busy market street, a sizable working-class population of Hindu and Muslim origin, as well as a middle-class Sikh community. Most of my interlocutors are Hindus from communities classified by the government of India as other backward classes, but they also include some Brahmin and Sikh families, as well as some Dalits and Muslims. This diversity is a reflection of what I call my octopus method, which consists of approaching the main religious nodes of the neighborhood. I primarily work in the Kali temple, but also in a smallish dargah and a church. And from these places, I follow my informants around to additional religious shrines and practices while acquiring in-depth knowledge about the compelling concerns that make them crisscross religious boundaries in search for divine intervention. Now, of course, crossing a religious boundary is usually not something people do as their first choice. It's something they do when other things fail, when hope is wearing thin. I don't have too much time for examples, but I'll expose you to a few. Take, for example, the many young men who were hanging around at the dargah of a certain Sayyid Baba. Most of them were Hindu low castes who were struggling to live up to their parents' hope of doing well to ensure social mobility for the entire family. They sat for entrance exam after entrance exam, wanting to join the army, the Air Force, the Indian Administrative Services, or a medical college, but with little or no success. In addition, many were struggling with the fees they were asked to pay up in order to appear for these entrance exams, whether over or under the table. As they kept trying, they worked, helping their father in the shop, their uncle in his motor garage, their friend in his Xerox shop, and so on. As their hope sank and their despair grew, they began trying out everything that could possibly help. So if an acquaintance happened to mention that they had got help from Sayyid Baba Shrine when they were in similar difficulties, this is where they went. And in this way, many of them became weekly regulars that I met every single Thursday evening at the shrine. The only requirement in such cases is an acknowledgement of the existence of these powers and their capacity to exist. Such beliefs need by no means be firm. What Campbell termed half-beliefs are generally more than enough. Often all it takes is an acknowledgement of a remote possibility or a tiny grain of hope. Now, low-caste Hindus seeking blessings and divine intervention at Sufi dargahs are hardly unusual. Nowadays, Hindu visitors often outnumber Muslim ones, which reflects the widespread effect of Islamic reformism and their claims that peer veneration is tantamount to shirk. But even Muslims can be tempted to defy such claims if their despair crosses a certain threshold, which brings me to the topic of discretion. And the clearest example that emerged in my fieldwork was that of a Muslim couple from Lucknow who suddenly turned up in the Kali temple in which I hung out as part of my fieldwork. With her dressed in burqa and him wearing a topi, there was certainly no attempt to hide their religious affiliation. Their discretion consisted in making the 2-hour journey all the way to Kanpur in order to prevent anybody they knew from recognizing them. If they had made do with approaching the goddess in one of her temples in Lucknow, they would have risked losing face, being ostracized, being accused for shirk, and possibly even charged for blasphemy, as in the case of the elderly Muslim couple in Bangladesh who were booked for worshipping Kali while reciting the Quran a year or two ago. Though I didn't have time to know this particular couple sufficiently well to find it appropriate to inquire what kind of problems they had approached the goddess for, they volunteered to the flower seller, who I knew very well, that sold them the offerings that they had come to buy, that they had approached the temple in order to thank the goddess. So as it turned out, they had approached her before and been blessed with a solution and had now come to do puja in gratitude. Okay, let me give you one more example. Because it's not only Muslims who need to be careful about stepping out of line. Once I witnessed my Hindu Brahmin landlord in a very awkward situation. I used to call him Papa, and he was around 75 at the time that I lived there. He was an Arya Samaji who had been a member of the RSS all his adult life. As a retiree, he spent most of his weekdays in the Arya Samaj temple compound with his own friends, and every Sunday he defied his aching body to join the neighborhood RSS Shaka. His political leanings made him scoff at my research topic. He said, "Don't waste your time talking to Muslims. If you want to learn about Indian religion, you should rather study the Gita and spend the days with me at the Arya Samaj temple." Very generous, of course. So one day, as I sat upstairs in his house writing field notes, I heard somebody singing on the street. It was a loud, clear voice singing about Allah. Peeping out of the window, I noticed that the voice belonged to a certain Farid Baba, one of the fakirs from the Sayyid Baba Dargah. He was traversing the streets to collect money for his little Hajj to Ajmer, singing loudly about his destination to attract attention from everyone who had not left for work or for school. On my way downstairs to give him a 50-rupee note, I suddenly bumped into Papa. Just like me, he was on the way to the gate with some money. Seeing me, he was deeply embarrassed. A proud RSS member giving money to a wandering Sufi Muslim Baba? What a loss of face. His initial reaction was to save it by insisting that a 10-rupee note was all he was willing to give. But then suddenly, Farid Baba lifted his hand like this to bless him. And somehow this gesture made Papa's bodily habitus take over in such a way that the only thing he could do was to bow his head to receive Farid Baba's blessing. After which he stormed back to his room and refused to speak to me for several weeks. So even when ritual inclusivity is not directly dangerous, it can still entail considerably loss of face to those who have spent a lifetime constructing a pure religious front stage, to use a well-tried term from Goffman. It took me quite some time to find out what his attachment was about, and I learned it from his daughter. As it turned out, she had been one of the regular Thursday visitors at the Sayyid Baba Dargah 25 years earlier, when she had been desperate to conceive. She had wanted a daughter and was eventually blessed with 2. So how could her family not venerate this shrine and its custodians? How much time do I have? Do I have time? 7 minutes. 7 minutes? Okay, I think I have time for one case more. So the final case of despair and discretion that I have space for here also hints at another dimension, which is the persuasiveness that unfamiliar divine rituals and entities can have simply by virtue of being unfamiliar. This is when rituals attain a quality of magic and sublimity in the sense of Kant. And I think this is what I witnessed at the space of an exorcist that I called Dr. Singh. Dr. Singh was a reputed Thakur Tantric, specializing in exorcism, whom I had come to know through a Brahmin priest living next door to the Kali temple. Every day, Dr. Singh received visitors from near and far who had problems that had persisted for so long that they were beginning to suspect that they were caused by spirit possession. Being a tantric of great local repute, Dr. Singh had at least 20 patients a day. Though most certainly were Hindus, there were also some Muslims and Christians among them. For certain city Muslims, it was evidently beneficial that Dr. Singh's premises were located a bit outside town and had few Muslim visitors. Because if they had gone to one of the dargahs in the city, where people suffering from spirit affliction also tend to cluster, the word would soon have been out that they had serious family trouble. So again, we see the prevalence of shame. In Dr. Singh's premises, however, they could be diagnosed and treated with exceptionally low risk of recognition. Besides, they could see Dr. Singh at work with all his other patients, which he did so confidently that it was impossible not to get impressed. The unfamiliarity of it all, combined with his self-confidence, had an eerily persuasive effect. But Dr. Singh knew that neither his non-Hindu clients nor the presumably non-Hindu spirits that had possessed them could be cured in the same way as Hindus. So for Muslim clients, he thus recited long Islamic incantations, beginning with the Basmala. And he also claimed to know effective Christian incantations, I didn't see them though, all designed to chase the jinn or the demon out from the same orifice they had used when sneaking in. As such, the ritual inclusivity suddenly swapped place. It was no longer the clients who committed it, but Dr. Singh himself, at the same time as his mastery of spirits and clients of all thinkable affiliations played a vital part in constructing his authority as a supreme exorcist. Now, ritual inclusivity conducted with discretion can be very hard to detect without fieldwork of the kind that we do in my project. But increasingly, it is evidently far more widespread than what most commentators seem to believe. And though the threshold for participating in unsanctioned ritual activities is far higher than for prescribed ritual activities, even unsanctioned ones tend to hold attraction as long as people believe in the possibility of efficacy, even if ever so faintly. Now, our project was of course not designed to assess the extent of ritual engagement across religious boundaries. If so, we would have been guilty of generating findings that are the product of our methods. But that being said, we have all been very surprised by the number of interfaith activities we actually encountered, particularly after having listened to the master narrative about decline for so long. So in the course of this project, I have thus come to reinterpret the master narrative of declining composite culture a little. Firstly, I've come to believe that the master narrative reflects the persistence of shared religious spaces as an ideal, even when pointing to a decline in practice. Besides documenting the shrinking propensity of Hindus to take part in Muharram processions, of Muslims to accept prasad from Hindu temples and so on, the contributions that generate this master narrative often contains a fair amount of personal memoirs, saturated with nostalgia over a lost shared world, combined with an anxiety for what hardened religious boundaries can do to such a multi-religious society as India. My favorite example is the cover story of India Today in February 1993, shortly after the demolition of the Babri Masjid unleashed on ethno-religious riots that left around 2,000 people dead across the country. In the cover story, 20 poets, craftsmen, artists, and architects had been asked to use their creativity to suggest how the land on which the Babri Masjid now lay in rubbles could be used to retrieve interreligious unity. No less than 7 of the 20 argued that the land should be used to bring people of different religious convictions together in worship. The subtext was clear. Shared worship was seen as an effective buffer against ethno-religious antagonism, which also helps explain its present status as an ideal and an object of nostalgia. So that's the first mode of reinterpreting it. The second one is that I've come to believe that the role of caste and class is even more significant than previously understood. Admittedly, it is a truism to point out that people of low-caste Hindu descent have fewer inhibitions than most others about moving beyond the religious identification of their family in pursuit of otherworldly protection. Perhaps they have less to prove. But from what I have seen, it is equally clear that class comes very strongly into play as well. When you have nowhere else to turn when you cannot pay the next rent, fail to conceive a baby, or your only son becomes suicidal, you move on if your own gods fail to listen. Upper-class people have fewer existential needs and more alternative ways to deal with those they have. When they struggle with the rent, they can ask a relative for loan, or even the bank. When they fail to conceive, they can consult a medical specialist or even consider IVF. When their only son becomes suicidal, they can nowadays send him to a shrink. It is, of course, true that economic security generates additional existential needs, as pointed out by, for instance, Maya Warrior. But such needs are primarily dealt with in the new spiritual movements that started to boom in the 1990s, and they require some money. So the informants that I have in this neighborhood in Kanpur, they don't approach them. So all in all, it's hardly the same kind of people who lament the decline of the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb in newspaper columns and blogs who actually keep it alive. And perhaps the growing distance between these segments augments its invisibility. And the third point about this narrative about decline is that it often translates into subtle acts of resistance. In a forthcoming article, the poet and scholar Afsar Muhammad draws attention to how Telugu language poets compose poems in memory of past syncretic practices as an antidote to the work of Islamic reform movements operative in the region. Similarly, the classical singer Madhumita Ray recently staged a series of concerts with text by Amir Khusrau, the medieval poet who blended his Sufi Islamic imagery with explicit devotion for Lord Krishna. As she stated in a talk in June this year, she did so to hold up an alternative to the destructive effects of saffronization under the present Modi government. Sometimes idealization of ritual inclusivity can also be more explicit. As our PhD candidate Mukesh Kumar shows from the Mewat region in Rajasthan, Mayo bards, who long used to defy classification as either Hindu or Muslim, still compose new songs in the honor of multiple divine entities to contest binary classification. Likewise, our PhD candidate Alimpana Goswami, doing fieldwork in Assam, reports how a student movement initiated a procession traversing all the religious shrines in town to galvanize its religious communities against external troublemakers, the idea evidently being that religious cosmopolitanism is just as religious as it is social. Combined, such examples speak volumes about the persisting ideal of ritual inclusivity, even as ritual inclusivity itself is weakening and goes underground. And now I'm coming to the conclusion, which is very short. The jury is still out on whether ritual engagement across religious boundaries actually does enhance interreligious relation, eases communal tension, or helps prevent interfaith skirmishes, as implied in the master narrative about decline. Robert Hayden's work on contested shrines and cases of ritual inclusivity that attract accusations of blasphemy that in turn may be politicized constitute crucial counter-evidence. All the same, I've noted that those who do take part in ritual activities beyond their primary identification generally refrain from making negative remarks about other religious traditions, though they certainly can make negative generalizations about their adherents. This is not just because the Indian Penal Code prescribes denigration of religion. A great number of those I meet hold even the religious traditions they distance themselves actively from to contain valuable snippets of truth. For a majority of my Hindu informants, the religious pigeonholing of the state hardly even makes sense. For them, God is one, and both Islam and Christianity are offshoots of Hinduism, just like Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. This is a topic that we also find in certain elements of Hindutva pseudo-historical treaties. So but it's not only there, it's also widespread in people who are distinctly non-Hindutva. So it's such patterns of thinking that enables ritual inclusivity. And it is deep existential anxiety that makes it materialize, sometimes despite considerable hindrances. And the worrisome corollary of all this is, and this is where I think the relevance to this conference is particularly strong, is that if India ever succeeds in becoming an evenly developed state, let alone a welfare state, where such anxieties are reduced to a minimum, we will probably have far more reason to worry about its viability as a multi-religious society. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathinka. We're opening for comments from Manali, and then we'll move to discussion.
Hi. So I didn't really get the papers in advance, and I've been taking notes. It's all right. It's okay. I had Ajantha's paper a couple of days in advance. So, you know, I've been just kind of thinking on the go as the papers were being presented, and I just want to begin by saying I think they're so thoughtful and, you know, provocative in some respects, and I think be really, perhaps what I could do just to kind of kick off the discussion is just to lay out sort of three main points here. We always have three, we never have four or two, so I'll do three. So I want to start with Subir's paper, which was music to my ears, because I have written in the same vein quite a lot, and there's really so much, you know, so much kind of bouncing off of, you know, the same ideas here. I wanted to kind of think a little bit about this idea of this provocative concept of the seamless canvas. Because, yes, I mean, at some level, I think it seems, there are so many indicators, if you will, of the kind of total capture of everyday life, of the realm of politics, the sort of, the kind of close connection between political claims in the political sphere as well as in sort of the embodiment and the lived experience in daily life. We talked about food and clothing and so on and so forth. I mean, at the same time, and I'm drawing a little bit here on kind of my own research, but also on the paper that Subir sent, which I quickly glanced at, because Subir, there kind of, and I have also, introduced this idea of thinking about sort of two things going on together. One is perhaps interpolation, whether you like or don't like the concept, but I think that's being implied a little bit in what Subir is saying, But there's also ambivalence. So in almost all of the interviews that I did with mostly kind of Dalit and OBC young people in Ahmedabad, the support, the sort of Modi, support from Modi, and drawing primarily on these ideas of modernity, that Modi represents, the Modi phenomenon represents something that moves away from the politics of caste, moves away from reservation, from all of these things, anti-Congressism, right? But in every instance, there's ambivalence about what Modi is really doing. So there, the lived reality of class, I think as Kathinka particularly points out in her paper, really became obvious. So for example, how do they square these aspirations with the reality that they don't actually have jobs? And if the jobs that are available, there's very high levels of unemployment in Gujarat. If the jobs are available, they're really precarious, they're, it's sort of daily humiliation of encountering circumstances that were related to me with sort of being, told you don't have a job tomorrow, the kind of deep insecurity of that kind of experience. So I think that maybe we really need to reconcile these two observations and think a little bit more seriously about ambivalence, even also in terms of the kind of questions you were asking yesterday about the politics of hope or political possibilities, because, I mean, when I see what Subir is also describing very eloquently and with loads of very good examples, I mean, it seems quite depressing. And I think, of course, it's also in the context of, I think Subir would agree, obviously it's a transnational kind of almost affirmation of this. If there are very few politics of hope that are easily visible elsewhere as well. So the kind of total destruction of an alternative, as it might seem, also lends some affirmation to this. And one, this quote you were describing from Nanika Mathur's thing, I think a lot of people are thinking, well, we push ahead with Modi because what else is there? You push ahead. You see the contradictions, but you push ahead because there is something there beyond. And I think that's where, that would be something to look at. The other point, the second point really I wanted to raise is something that, I was actually at a really interesting conference a couple of months ago on populism, actually. And Ghassan Haj was presenting his work on whiteness. And it was quite an interesting idea, which we could sometimes, I think, bring some of these ideas a little bit more into our work on South Asia as well, because there's some, one of the things he described about whiteness is actually that it is a kind of status work of an elite that feels a lack of mobility, that there is actually, we talk a lot about, we talk a lot about sort of lower class, the sort of immobility or even the downward mobility, but actually there are very few sections of the so-called middle classes that are really clearly experiencing upward mobility as well. I mean, we have to look at that a little bit more carefully because I don't think that's a straightforward narrative that even so-called middle class people would ascribe to themselves in India. And so this status work is something that I think was quite an interesting idea. And, he was arguing that racism actually is is an aspect of the status work which is so compelling because it, in his own words, I'm just looking back at my notes here, he said something like, its own lack of logic or its its correctness, the thing that it can't be falsified, makes it very compelling, and it makes it a very powerful form of politics for the elite to appropriate. So I think the status work is very similar to the kind of thing Ajantha is describing in terms of merit, the movement of caste outside of the political field into notions of individual and collective merit, and that status distinctions in a Bourdieuian sense that you're pointing to is that kind of very energetic work that is being done in a lot of other spheres as well. Why? I mean, perhaps to some extent, this may have something to do with also a simultaneous decline in the idea of redistribution as a compelling ideal, in the realm of politics. And I mean, we can discuss that. It's just a thought that kind of popped into my head, and yeah. The third point, well, actually, I want to just see. I wonder if there's something related there that I'm missing out. Probably. Yeah. I mean, I think I just wanted to say something about the status work as well. That so we observe this happening, but I'm thinking analytically, do we then sometimes, is there the effect of occluding the class, the effect, you can call it class or the politics of redistribution, and I think it just returns back to this point that a lot of this is happening in the context of a political economy of precarity and uncertainty. So that's really important, I think, to keep in the mix. I just wanted to, a third point, and I wanted to just come back to Kathinka's really interesting point. The front stage and backstage idea that you picked up from Goffman, I've been thinking a little bit about that in terms of, also in terms of populism, in the sense that, is there something, we observe this obviously happening in the US right now, but, sort of long-held private beliefs that were never okay to mention have now become absolutely the norm, the new normal, right? This kind of, it's the vulgarity, the kind of racism, the sort of denigration and so forth is okay. It's absolutely okay to use that sort of language. And so that, I wonder whether that also is something that is that new, and what's enabling that? I just thought that would be sort of something quite interesting. And I just wanted to ask Kathinka, I just wondered about, this is a more specific question about your term ritual inclusivity, because through a quick reading of your paper, I really apologize if I was representing it, but I thought that what you were showing, though, was a more selective crossing of religious boundaries. And I've seen that, throughout. I mean, certainly even in my own family, I was thinking very autobiographically throughout a lot of this stuff. And I'll mention this one last point later on. But, it was entirely in a very Hindu family, okay to visit a dargah if there's a kind of, but you're selectively crossing that boundary. And I don't know whether I would really call that ritual inclusivity in the sense that I understand the term inclusivity. I just want to return back to this question finally about populism. So actually it's 4 points. Subir, you mentioned post-1947 and these 3 moments, but I wonder whether we need to go back to Gandhi a little bit here, because there seems to be like this kind of not new, but in fact, I think quite old, sort of a resurrection of this importance of the body, all this stuff about yoga and the calm. You had in your other paper, all these images of Modi, the importance of the transformation of his own image, the projection of this image as the sort of calm, but yogi, actually, in some respects also. And I was looking at the contrast with this picture of the sort of angry and, so sort of creating these dualities between the disciplined body and the undisciplined masses is perhaps something that really has such a strong resonance for such a long period, such a long time, that something, that it might always, it's like a return of this kind of, that mode of politics at a time when perhaps there's a collective experiencing of some idea of crisis. So I'm just going to stop there and say I really enjoyed reading these and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We're a bit short on time, so I'm wondering if we should just open it up for questions, and as you guys come back, you can also address Manali's points. first.
Thank you. It's a very, very interesting panel. But I was actually thinking, my question is going to be for Ajantha, but I was actually thinking that the unmarked category in this entire panel was actually men. And that the acting was being done by specifically men in most of the cases. And so, Ajantha, I wanted to actually ask you that how does your story of caste and merit get complicated by the entrance of women in IIT Madras? IIT Madras has more women than any other IITs, or at least in the last few years, they've been entering more than in the other IITs. And I was really wondering that this particular story of the naturalization of merit is also a masculine upper caste story. Or is it, do you think, just as true of women? So I'd really like to see how you think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm asked this question every time I present this. So I think one of the reasons why I do talk about masculinity, right? And the sort of forging of certain kinds of upper caste masculinity at the IITs. Gender is not, it's not nearly as important an axis of social differentiation when it comes to the question of merit as caste is at the IITs. I mean, there's just no question about that. So it is the case that IIT Madras has more women than the other IITs. It's still lower than 10% of the total student body. And I did a huge number of interviews with women.
I'm actually thinking more about masculinity in terms of gender. Not, I did bring up women, but really I'm actually interested in how masculinity works as part of the merit story.
Yeah, but just to sort of finish the gender point. So the women I spoke to largely shared the arguments about caste difference as the sort of principal determinant of conceptual ability, of kind of intellectual ability, right? So there wasn't a huge variation between, what the men said, right, about how caste figures in the sort of determination of merit and what women said. And in fact, the other sort of unspoken other, right, in the story are the regional engineering colleges. So IIT Madras is literally across the street from Anna University. And if you compare the sort of gender composition of those two student bodies, I mean, Anna University has upwards of 45% women, right? So there's been far more gender inclusivity when it comes to regional engineering than so there's a way that caste is sort of so overdetermined, right, as the main axis on which difference is drawn. Masculinity, I mean, it's I didn't have time to go into very much, but I mean, one of the things that I try to look at are just this kind of ongoing diagnostics of the body, right, and of sort of everyday behavior, right? How does one know a lower caste body when you see one, right? I mean, what are the sort of telltale signs? And one of the things that's really interesting is a kind of the need to dress down. So there's a sort of like performed, performed slumminess, right? Like you got to wear your tattered jeans. You have to sort of perform a disregard for bodily comportment, right? So this is one of the ways in which upper caste masculinity gets constituted, right? That you only care about your mind and not your body, right? You are pure mind. So if you're a backward caste student, right? And I spoke to this one student who had this fascinating story. He lives in Chennai, so he goes back and forth between his parents' home and the campus. And he says he makes a point of taking off his shoes and switching into chappals when he comes onto campus, right? Because to wear proper clothing, is to signal, nouveau riche, backward casteness, right? So there are all of these ways that, upper caste masculinity is about the sort of preeminence of the mind, right? As the sort of main, arbiter of identity, right? So that's just one example. But there are many, many, many examples. Yeah.
Just very quickly on that point, Ajantha, I wondered if, I've been bugging Nandini about this quietly, but if you read Nandini and Ravinder's piece on social mobility, where they talk about how social mobility has become so much about dressing up and the work of aesthetics and looking the part, I think is what you said. So is social mobility a category you're dealing with? And I wonder what role aesthetics plays in that. And then I just wondered about passing, right? Like these stories of people saying they don't know, I'm low caste, etc. And again, the politics around aesthetics and the body in those kind of passings.
Does somebody else want to also talk about social mobility before I answer?
I think this is for you, actually.
Well, actually, yeah, social mobility is more for.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the much of the work of shoring up upper casteness that I'm talking about is about making it an investable category, right? It's about making it a space of capital investment, right? So, and yes, one of the things that the IITs has allowed for is a kind of spectacular shift in socioeconomic circumstances, right? So, I mean, as I said, most IITians are the children of civil servants, right? So in one generation, you've seen a shift from sort of middle-class salaries, right, to, sort of corporate managerial wealth, right? So, I mean, it's a kind of spectacular sort of rise a spectacular shift in the sort of possibilities of accumulation, right? And for me, this is part of this is why upper casteness, right, it's so heavily protected and has to be sort of policed in the way that it is, right? And you see this, I mean, in the U.S. and increasingly in India too. It's about entrepreneurialism, right? So, what is upper casteness? What does it signal? It signals the capacity for a sort of self-made entrepreneurialism, right? And this is one, I don't know what you all thought about me saying this is not about the new Brahmanism. I'm still trying to work this out, but for me, one of the reasons why it seems somewhat different is that the kind of, the model, right, of the caste subject that's in play here, it's not the ascetic, it's the accumulator par excellence, right? It's somebody who can sort of draw investment, right? So, yeah, maybe I should just pass it on.
Kathinka, Subir, would any of you want to comment?
And so one other thing, that it's both about drawing investment, right, and being a kind of site of accumulation, and entrepreneurialism being the sort of like preeminent sort of example of this. But it's also, I mean, and this is where I think this kind of dialectic between claims to merit and low-caste rights is so important. It's about a sort of defensive maneuver in the face of perceived kind of low-caste political advancement, right? That, with the political sphere, and the sort of the Modi phenomenon is interesting here, but with this sense, and, this is acute in Tamil Nadu, but I think it's also a sort of a more generalized phenomenon, the sense that the sort of the political sphere has been taken over. And so it's really these private spaces, right? It's these private spaces of accumulation, it's the diaspora. These are the sites where it becomes possible to sort of re-entrench upper caste power, right? And so there's a kind of sense of victimization that also accompanies this sort of project of shoring up upper casteness, which also I think is different. That's, I think, partly what makes it different for me than simply saying that it's the new Brahmanism, right?
Yeah, I just actually want to get back to some of what Mandali said, and then probably maybe connect to some of what you're saying. I really wanted to address your ambivalence point. And in particular, there's, I think, two degrees of ambivalence. One is the nature of populism itself. And here, one of the sort of things which is quite interesting is, and I sort of brought up the idea of subaltern complicity, how much complicity is there in demolishing the idea of political equality, which is otherwise the essence of liberal democracy or the rule of law. So, for example, the idea of people who are half or possibly non-citizens of, Muslims or Dalits and so on, but also widespread support for encounters, kind of a popular authorization of illegality by the state. That seems to be another sort of major issue here. Ambivalence also at two other levels. One is if you look at the issue of Nehru, and against, the kind of big leader against which every other leader has to be compared. I think it was just last month that one news item came out that WhatsApp is responsible for a majority of people under 30 holding extremely negative views about Nehru. So, among things that have come out, one could think in terms of Nehru was not Hindu, he was Muslim. Yes, this is quite common among RSS WhatsApp groups and things like that. A lot of pictures, morphed images-wise, where he is lasciviously looking at dancers or, smoking a cigarette, etc. Not so much for Gandhi, because I think there is still a kind of internalization of Gandhi within the kind of BJP politics. And I think partly it is because of the fact that Gandhi, on the one hand, is obviously pedagogical with relation to subalterns, but also has an element of incorporating subalterns as they are, rather than, so the religiosity element and things of that sort. So, I mean, there's a kind of a, ambivalence, but there are also clarifying moments, in particular with respect to, JNU is a bad place. I mean, Kavita can probably talk about the controversy regarding the free sex debate and stuff like that which took place, where you did have, kind of BJP MLAs and so on who made statements such as there are 3,000 condoms in the garbage cans of JNU, that sort of, scenario. So a very strong attack on, I mean, not that Indian politics or society was ever liberal, but to the extent that one could identify, some elements of liberalism within that, I find it quite interesting that with the current phenomenon, there is a systematic attack on people who are seen as bearers of that liberalism, but also certain kinds of practices which therefore authorize things like love jihad or, who can sleep with whom or have children, fears of miscegenation and so on. Finally, back to the question of Modi and maybe the rational, irrational thing. I mean, for my sins, I've followed a lot of Modi speeches for the last 2 years, and they're quite entertaining at one level if you weren't completely repulsed by that. So, I mean, among other, and there's a phenomenon of erasing old speeches on YouTube, which I find quite interesting also, which is how the kind of using quite modern technology to completely cleanse a person of his past, right? So you have no photographs. There's a famous, highly bigoted speech he gave at a place called the Becharji Temple, right after the 2002 massacres. You will not find that on YouTube anymore. So there is a lot of going back to technology to create a space of ambivalence in such a way that Modi appears in relation to Nehru, a better leader. Interestingly, you can see, whereas Nehru is almost entirely erased from official narratives now, Indira Gandhi is not entirely erased from the official narrative now. And in fact, if there is any comparator that he refers back to from time to time, it is Indira Gandhi. So in terms of populism and the leader, it seems to me that the Nehruvian ideal is now over, and you've got the kind of authoritarian, leader like that. So.
Yeah, can I just build on to that? Because I think you, by referring to all these WhatsApp things and the things that happen on the net, I think it's extremely important, and that would also challenge a little bit your suggestion that, despite your very interesting points, but it would challenge a little bit your suggestion that we can think about these things in terms of front stage and backstage, and I think those only work for very short time spans. But if you look at longer developments, I don't really think it's the case that we can only analyze this as, you know, something that has been hidden that is coming out, such as racist categorizations and this and that, because these are also things that are being produced, reinforced, taught to, I mean, transmitted to new generations through selective news media, fabricated stuff, public discourses, and also what I think is very interesting to look at is the increasing use of visuals, you know, that circulate like wildfire sometimes on WhatsApp. I mean, just a few years ago it was Facebook, now it's WhatsApp, and I don't know what this is going to be in 2 years. But so there's also, you know, a very strong element of production that I think we need to look at. Secondly,
Production of images kind of thing, you see.
Yeah, or production of discourses, production of imagery, production of, you know. You also raised a point which I think is interesting, whether I can talk about the things that I talk about in terms of inclusion, ritual inclusion. Well, I do, because I don't necessarily see inclusion as a mode of all-inclusiveness. I see it as stretching one's ritual repertoire at certain points of time in life, sometimes for a long time in gratitude. So I don't see it as necessarily embracing of each and everything. So I do think we actually mean the same. We just use different terms, I think. But I think it's really, really widespread and surprisingly unaccounted for, actually. Though each and every family has their story, and that's the interesting part.
Mine is for Kathinka. I just wondered, because you know, it also links up with the point that Subir mentioned briefly, which is that there's also some of this compositeness or shared rituals, etc., is also given some kind of institutional shape in some of the, for instance, the deras. All right, so they actually will have, you know. I mean, it's there in the Sikh religion as well, but in the deras also. So, for instance, the Beas Dera, I know the Radha Swami Satsang Dera. So they draw upon a whole lot of, you know, different, whatever, spiritual legacies. But there is, however, in spite of it all, there is, and they are catering to. So in a way, it's a, you know, there's a sense of subaltern, sense of belonging. So there's a sense of, you know, poor people who will feel a sense of community there and a sense of, you know, shared food, etc. Things like I have met people who belong to the Dera Sacha Sauda because it offered them a place for de-addiction. So alcoholism, you know, so giving up. So, you know, tremendous sense of allegiance because. Now the thing is that although there is these somewhat, you know, progressive aspects, you can say, or composite aspects, and in a way almost publicly acknowledged, but yet there is also a political, you know, they play a political role. So often a political role of solidifying, including a growing closeness with the Sangh, you know, thing. So I'm just wondering how you look at that, because is it that these, you know, the existence or persistence of these practices is actually a buffer against, you know, whatever consolidation of communal fascism kind of thing, or you know, other ways in which it's accommodated? How do you? I mean, I'm just wondering about it.
I think we'll bring in some of those questions as well.
This is for Subir. Sorry. So it seems, I mean, the underlying sort of framework you're using is one of populism, using Laclau and so on, and trying to place Modi in that. And I was wondering, whether, because populism has this thing about this relation with the leader and the people, you know, going above an institutional form and some atomized people coming in. But to me, the role of the parties, which is sort of necessarily antithetical to populism generally in the framework. And I was wondering to what extent can we understand the modern Indian right in terms of a long, you know, sort of slog of ideological groundwork, network done over years, of which now this is a pretty, you know, organized form, and people coming in and not sort of atomized through WhatsApp groups, but we are actually pretty forms of newer organization. They're not just sort of, you know, irrationally reaching the sort of atomized people sitting in their own little corners through these information networks, but there's actually kind of deep organization. And because a lot rides on our analysis of which way we read this situation as sort of this organized group or populist ones.
We'll bring it on this one.
this fits in well with Shantata's point. Sort of listening to the papers together, I was wondering how you'd reconcile this analysis of Modi as populist, as sort of equating the people with a big P with people with a small p, including everyone, with the RSS and the Sang's historical roots, or sort of ongoing project of sort of shoring up upper caste patriarchal authority. So where's hierarchy in this? How does hierarchy map or fit with this? The other, really quickly, I was sort of struck by the parallel between Ajantha and Anu's papers yesterday around the the caste race analogy, and how it enables an internationalization of caste. In the one case, to make new claims, caste so Dalits as black people versus upper caste as WASPs, allowing a sort of new.
It's better than WASPs.
Better than WASPs. Sorry.
I think we'll let the panelists respond, and then we'll do another round of questions after that.
Do you want to go that way and sort of come this way? Yeah. Should I start?
Okay. Thanks very much. I mean, on the DERA's thing, I mean, sorry to sort of bring in primitive accumulation all over again, but, there is that element to that where, there isn't, in India and in many other places, the possibility for the kind of pastoral state that does arise in some places, and DERA's probably, kind of come in there. Obviously, they have large amounts of land allotted to them by all kinds of political parties. On your point on parties and whether this is entirely one of those cases of long, hard slog work finally paying off for the Sangh and things like that, I think only up to a point, in the sense that not everyone who voted for Modi is Sanghi. Obviously, it was very important for him to, especially after 2008 or 9, to break out of a Sangh-only kind of a candidate. If you think in terms of the fact that even now only 31% of the population, of the voters voted for him, the point I was trying to make with the kind of seamless canvas was that there are multiple registers operating at the same time. You have people who, and in terms of complicity, for example, who say that we are voting for him precisely because of what he did in Gujarat, and we would like that to happen in other places as well. So there is no kind of mask in terms of what he was all about and stuff like that. But then, if you look at Christophe, Joffrelo's work on especially the neo-middle classes, the slightly techno-fetishists who kind of buy that, accelerationist argument regarding rapid growth is the best way forward and he can do it. The kind of myth of the development model of Gujarat and stuff like that. So I think if it was just the RSS, unless we make an argument that 30% of the electorate is RSS, I think there is a lot of that. And I think on the WhatsApp, I mean, I find WhatsApp so fascinating precisely because I see a lot of practices that one could think of as, interpellative as one at one level, but also kind of self-enrollment into the Modi project. Like I know people who were very gung-ho Rajiv Gandhi fans at one point, partly also because of the techno-fetishism involved in that particular, hero worship, who have then kind of moved on to this degree of techno-fetishism. Because I think for a lot of young Indians, there is an IIT phenomenon that we produce the best engineers in the world, but then we have access to some kind of technology which should therefore make us some kind of a leader, that wish for guru, for example, discourse that comes up. Another thing, particularly for Modi, the kind of sharing within a pool of cultural resources is extremely important. So if you think in terms of many jokes, one could close one's eyes and think that maybe it is Amitabh Bachchan in a movie, in terms of how scripted he sounds in terms of many speeches and so on. But also, particularly for Eastern India and for Bengal, you will find anytime he goes there, there are lots of pictures with Vivekanand in the background. Yeah, so just the identity of Narendra, that sort of thing. And in fact, Jyotirmay Sharma has got a highly provocative book on, that sort of thing. Particularly after 2014, 2015, this putting Vivekanand in the background and appearing as if he was Vivekanand. There's, I think, some very subtle image play that is going on there as well, which is partly produced by highly slick, producers of images. But the fact that as a leader, he has such a massive lead over everyone else is because he is personally extremely conscious of images and, the political functions that they have. And I think in a very telling speech, which initially struck me as being a very weird and out of place speech, he talked about memes and how memes are, sort of capsules of thought, and they kind of have a life of their own, and then people take them and they do whatever they like and so forth. But just as a way of thinking about how something he utters then takes on a life of its own, and then people fill those things with whatever they're projecting onto it, I think that's a key element of that success. And so it differs from the classic populism, where the leader is far more directly involved in telling you stuff. And in one way, this is a more kind of Foucauldian kind of populism, insofar as it also depends such a lot on willing subjects who sort of self-enroll in this, much more than just an interpellative scenario where there is possibly also a reversal of the interpellative, function.
Should I continue? Yes, thank you. My response is to Kavita primarily, and I'm very, very happy that you brought up the question of the Deras and the new spiritual movements, because I mean, it's an entirely different religious phenomenon, right? Because it's based on community. There's a housing. People spend longer time together. It's more, it's sociology speaking. It's quite different. But I do think that there is a striking commonality in at least the rhetoric of oneness that is expressed in many of these movements. I did field work on several of these movements in the mid-2000s in New Delhi, and I was also in Haridwar staying at some New Agey places in the mid-2000s, and I saw this sort of rhetoric of being all-embracing, being beyond and above all these divisions. It was really, really very strong. And to a certain extent, these movements were also a little bit eclectic in their ritual repertoire, but not very. But I do think it's a phenomenon and a sort of willingness to sort of go beyond that is quite striking. I mean, you mentioned, of course, Guru Ram Singh, but there's also the figure of Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, which I think is quite interesting. I mean, on the one hand, he is this super popular guru with millions of followers all over the world, and on the who's very Hindu in many ways. But on the other hand, he's this sort of embracing, trying to speak for everyone, trying to help everyone, welcoming everyone. And I think it's quite interesting to see also that as the riots in Gujarat were going on, he was finishing this book about the similarities between Hinduism and Islam, which he hoped would help. And of course, that book caused a lot of trouble instead, so that's another question. But at least there was a willingness to try, and I think this is quite significant. So when I read, for instance, Mirananda's argument that this is, all this Hinduization is turning India into a dangerous state with all these new religious movements, I'm not really sure if I agree. Or I'm at least more ambivalent to it.
But Sri Ravi Shankar is now, he's openly kind of campaigns for Modi, in a very intelligent way.
Yep.
And so do many of the others in the groups, Sadhguru
Yep.
and all. So where they don't speak, they deliberately don't speak the language of anti-Muslim hatred.
No.
But they try to rehabilitate a lot of Southern ideology. More and more.
But it's not as closed as it would be if you look at the sort of Pakka Hindutva rhetoric. It still has this idea of speaking for all, even though it is, very BJP friendly. So I think there's a doubleness to it that we need to find out how to analyze.
So, I mean, one thing about the dethroning of Nehru, right? So now, Sandeep and Dave had that book on the IITs. It's like this hagiography of the IIT system. And there he's like, we keep thinking of Nehru as the sort of, as the sort of brain behind the IITs. It's not Nehru, right? So now the sort of the story that is that it wasn't Nehru at all. It was Dalal, Adeshit Dalal, right? Who was this sort of Parsi technocrat. So once again, there's a kind of way of distancing the IIT from the developmental state once and for all, right? And sort of recuperating as this other kind of space. In terms of the caste and race, I mean, there's a really interesting, I didn't talk about what's happening on IIT campuses right now, but, I'm sure a lot of you have followed the sort of open clashes between the kind of Hindu right and groups like the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle. And this has all been a kind of post-2008 phenomenon, right? I mean, with the entry of many more OBC students, and especially at the postgraduate level, right? And these are students who, I think most of the sort of students at the front of these new forms of mobilization are from Kerala and Tamil Nadu. So, I mean, what's happened is that, you have this much starker form of ideological polarization than you've ever seen before. So you have on the sort of Hindu right side a kind of open embrace of Vedic science and technology, right? So there's a kind of a steady stream of speakers now, who are all trying to sort of argue for Vedic science, who are arguing for the kind of Hindu claims on the history of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of that happening, right? And it's all sort of framed in terms of a kind of racial arrival, right? So this is finally, the sort of the Hindu race has arrived on the stage of global modernity. And and you see this reflected on the American side as well. I mean, Modi had an ecstatic reaction, right? Ecstatic, right? Not reaction, reception, ecstatic reception in the US when he came in 2015. And, there's this really sort of palpable sense I've gotten from talking to sort of these Silicon Valley sort of bigwigs that, for them, the BJP has long been seen as really sort of emblematic of the end of the, sort of nail in the sort of final, the final nail in the coffin of state developmentalism, the sort of unleashing of economic potential, and the global recognition of the technological Indian, right? So this is for them, the BJP and Modi in particular has really sort of allowed for them to acquire a new kind of global status, right?
Can I just briefly respond? I mean, Sadhguru particularly seems very much an IIT Madras kind of guru. I mean, his classes are called the inner engineering classes.
Who's?
Sadhguru. He charges £650 for a weekend. You can also, in London, you can also go for executive weekends, where you pay £1,300. So there's a kind of total internalization of the discourse at a superficial level, but also the prices and stuff like that. All very comfortable, sort of floating, in and out. On the issue of NRIs, I mean, we did a bit of this in terms of, we thought, okay, fine, let's see. Some of you might be aware that we got into trouble for organizing the anti-Modi demonstrations in London. So some of us were doing that. Some other people were trying to get into the Modi, thing, to get inside Wembley, stadium to see how this thing works. It's not easy to get in. Okay, you are vetted by a whole range of so-called community organizations. So in other words, the crowd is not a spontaneous crowd of NRIs. The crowd
highly
itself,
selected.
The crowd
highly
you
selected.
go through VHP affiliates or Hindu Society affiliates or Temple affiliates, or you have recommendations from overseas friends of the BJP, because what they're not looking for is for people to say, what about 2002 inside of Wembley Stadium? Not only that, the security is at least as heavy as any airport, where you have to go through like 3-4 hours in advance, that kind of thing, and so on. So on that, so you've got, that's what I'm saying in terms of the hyper reality, where between the simulation of reality as the grand reception and the reality as a very selected few who get in there is blurred between one thing and another.
I think there are two final questions, Torvald and then Sunil. Short questions, because we're about to break for coffee, and short answers as well.
Yeah, thanks for very interesting presentations. First, I want to point to Kathinka's presentation. I think you're tapping into a deeper social logic that is maybe not possible to be overruled by political initiatives, like the politics of suffering. For example, the promise of upward mobility reaches far beyond the economic possibility for most people of that. You will, for each person experiencing mobility, you will have tens and hundreds of people who have been captured by the dream of it and have to somehow accommodate the loss of it. And these are looking for possibilities. So I think you are actually tapping into something which is growing and which will grow even more as you see the gap between the general economic development and the social spread of that economic wealth. So kind of seeing the dark side of that development, actually, and how people have to cope with it. And maybe there are many other strategies like that. The other element of suffering, I had the pleasure to be present during the demonetization, and because I was very irritated, I had a lot of debates with my Indian friends, you know. They had to stand in long queues, suffering queues for, you know, several hours every day. But still, they supported it a lot. And the longer they had to stand in queues, the more they supported it. And they were very obvious in their argumentation, so this is not my diagnosis of it, you know, they were kind of doing a sacrifice. They were able to sacrifice something for the fight against corruption. And I think this is some of the genius of Modi actually. He's like mobilizing the kind of social and cultural body in a way that, okay, you can use Foucault to analyze those kind of powers that might be unleashed in that way. Of course, you can have some intelligent perspective saying that, okay, the huge part of corruption is actually not in cash, but doing that kind of almost far away academic work of doing something with the banks and the online economy would not mobilize the people, giving them the opportunity to be part of it and doing some sacrifice in that context. So I think there's something important going on there. And last, I really like this analysis of merit, which of course I see as deeply inspired by, as was mentioned here, Bourdieu. It's a kind of brilliant way of showing that if caste dominance is going to be really effective, it has to be portrayed as something else, even by the people being part of that dominance. Because people have to believe in merit for that to be really effective as a kind of power dimension. So I think it's not people like playing a kind of game or trying to hide something, but it's a deeper phenomenon than that. It's like a kind of dominance is already withering away and becoming past if it is seen as dominance, even by the people who are dominating. So I think that's part of the logic.
As the sort of conversation proceeded, it seemed that we were more and more talking about Hinduism rather than populism in some ways. And in all of the papers sort of address this, particularly. And Ashish Nandi had made this sort of argument, and many others have made this argument, that actually the biggest obstacle to Hindutva is Hinduism itself, right? And I think, Kathinka, you're sort of pointing to this, but that's what makes people like Sri Ravi Shankar particularly pernicious, is they're allowing Hindutva then to come occupy and to claim to speak for Hinduism more broadly, right? And that was also something that Nehru, if you look at his rhetoric, especially from the early 1950s, or even after Gandhiji's sort of assassination, he's constantly saying that actually I know more about Hinduism in one finger than these guys, and he would go around claiming I'm the Panditji. Actually, you have to remember this, So I'm wondering, do you think that sort of hegemonic project has been achieved already? That Hindutva has actually been able to come and occupy the space of Hinduism and thus the sort of national as such, or is there still, Kathinka, you still seem to see some potential in the sort of that this isn't the case, right? So I'm wondering if you guys, how you guys are thinking about this relationship between Hindutva and Hinduism, sort of more broadly.
On the sacrifice issue, I do agree with you, because the part of the new populism is the mobilization of the people and in a kind of language of inclusion. And demonetization was not the only, or in fact, it was not the first sacrifice element. If you remember, even in the run-up to the elections and shortly after that in 2014, he was collecting iron tools from farmers, apparently. so that that could all be melted into the statue of Patel, that is going to come up in Gujarat and stuff like that. So there was these rituals of inclusion, if you want to, kind of think of that in a more political sort of way. I do agree. I don't agree that hegemony of Hindutva is established in such a way that it can stand for Hinduism, as such. And in fact, there's some very interesting, like Golwalkar, for example, had a long conversation with Kurian, who was the founder of Amul, dairy. And at the end of all of that, and he was given, he asked many questions about what can cows be used for and stuff like that. And so when Kurian asked him, so what do you want to use cows for politics? And he said, yes, that's my only interest in the cow, is as a political animal, okay? So, there is a number of scenarios where you can find Hindutva. I also like what you pointed out about Nehru, because in fact, when I was talking about the charges of not being authentic coming from the right for Nehru, there's a series of photographs released by Nehru and people close to Nehru that show him wearing a janeu. So which I actually have on my laptop. So his janeu ceremony as a child, which also lays to rest the controversy about him being a Muslim, and then later on in his life, like in the late 50s, early 60s, you have a series of pictures of him bathing with the janeu in the Ganga at the Sangam in Allahabad, where again the panditness of Nehru is sort of brought to the fore. So I think that's an interesting point, which is.
Patel makes it, so this appropriation of Patel's, but he says openly that these guys know nothing about Hinduism.
Exactly. But then he insists, and people respond by calling him more and more Pandit Nehru, and in fact that becomes far more dominant as a way to know him. The fact that Nehru himself had to become Hinduized is an interesting precursor to the Hinduization of the polity, perhaps later on.
Thank you for bringing that point up. I think there's a lot of merit in what Ashish Nandi said, and I find the struggle between Hinduism and Hindutva mode of thinking all the time, wherever I turn, in the same persons. And I think we see it very clearly when we look at what people do in addition to what they say, in addition to what they write, and especially to try to understand this from domains that are not limited to political discourse is crucial to this. I think you really have to see what people do when they don't talk about politics. Otherwise, you're not going to see that contradiction. So I can see, my young men, frustrated Hindu informants, for instance. I mean, they can do all these things that I talked about in the paper. At the same time, they can circulate, these pictographic versions of urban myths about cows being slaughtered and being furious about that. Which really feeds into the Hindutva discourse going on right now. And these things happen at the same time, and they run parallel. And I don't really have the analytical language to talk about how they relate to one another, but they are there, both of them. And it's as if, the Hindutva version is stronger and stronger, yes, unfortunately, but it's not the only thing there is.
I guess two things, one on Hinduism and one on merit. If you look at Tamil Nadu, you look at something like the Jallikattu protests, for instance. There's active, and it's not in the domain of piety. It's politics, right? There's a sort of active opposition to efforts to extend a kind of, what is perceived as a sort of Sanskritic logic of Hinduism, right? To encompass all of the subcontinent, right? So, the Jallikattu protests were framed in terms of a kind of the uprising of autochthonous culture, right, in the face of sort of northern Hindi aggression. So, that way of trying to sort of point to schisms, which are sometimes framed in regional terms, sometimes in caste terms, right, and reclaim some sort of space of religious / cultural practice, right, that is antithetical, right, to sort of Brahminical or Sanskritic Hinduism, and identifying Modi with that project. It's still alive and well, right? It hasn't gone away. So I think it depends on where your vantage point is, right? So and about merit, I mean, it's really interesting. Yes, I think you're right that it's not simply a kind of cynical ideology, right? It's a belief system. It really is a belief system, and I mean, Tamil Nadu is a really interesting example of this because on the one hand, there's this sort of consistent effort to sort of expose the Brahmin, right? And I mean, the Brahmin sort of stands in for various kinds of upper caste, but, you know, to sort of say merit is about illegitimately accumulated capital, right? On the other hand, I mean, Tamil Nadu has more engineering colleges than any, you know, state in the country, right? There is, I mean, part of the sort of contestation of Brahminical dominance, right, in the professions was to make a demand on the professions, right? It wasn't to try to revalorize forms of caste labor, right, that were associated with low caste. I mean, there was a kind of rhetorical sort of valorization of sort of low caste labor, but when you actually look at the kind of economic sphere in Tamil Nadu, I mean, it doesn't look that different from other places. And in fact, there's been an even greater emphasis, right, on a low-cost claim to professions as status, right? And this is part of the sort of competition between the sort of upper and the backward, right? So, so in that sense, I don't think that the kind of the hegemony of merit, right, and of the professions as standing in for intellectual merit, I don't think that has been destabilized in Tamil Nadu. I think the sort of the upper caste claim on that, in some ways, is challenged, but I don't think that this has led to a real questioning of the hierarchies of labor and value, right? I mean, that I don't think has happened, and in part, I think it is because of the dominance of meritocracy, sort of as a kind of ideal, right? So, I think it's a sort of complicated story, and I think it looks very different. I mean, the reach of Dravidianism as a transformative politics, you know, I mean, its limits are seen most clearly, right, when you look at, say, Dalit politics, right, and when you look at the status of low-caste labor.
All right, I think we should give our panel a hand.